Hi, I'm Alex. We went to the moon with primitive computers. Now with technology a million times more powerful, we cannot return. Today we're exploring why humanity's greatest achievement became impossible to repeat. What did we lose that technology cannot replace? Before we start, a gentle subscribe helps this channel keep growing. Now, let's begin. In 1969, humanity landed on the moon using computers weaker than the microwave oven sitting in your kitchen. Today, in 2024, the smartphone in your pocket contains more processing power than every Apollo mission combined. More computational capability than existed in the entire world when Neil Armstrong took his first step on lunar soil. Yet we cannot return to that same grey surface that lies just 239,000 miles away. This is not a story about technological regression. This is not a tale of forgotten skills or lost blueprints, though both play their parts. This is something far more disturbing, far more profound. We dismantled ourselves, deliberately, systematically, with full knowledge of what we were destroying. The rockets that carried astronauts beyond Earth's gravity no longer exist in any functional form. The factories that built them stand empty or repurposed. The engineers who understood how every component fit together have retired to quiet lives, their knowledge unrecorded, their expertise evaporated into the past. And rebuilding what they created is not simply difficult or expensive, it is in the most literal sense impossible. Not because the laws of physics have changed, not because our tools have become inadequate, but because the knowledge itself has vanished. What remains is a paradox so strange, so counterintuitive, that it reveals uncomfortable truths about how civilization actually preserves and loses capability. We possess the blueprints. Thousands upon thousands of technical drawings sit in climate-controlled archives, meticulously preserved, perfectly legible. We have photographs, documentation, test reports, and specifications that describe in exhaustive detail what was built and how it performed. Yet these documents are corpses without souls. They show us what existed, but they cannot explain how to make it exist again. The critical distinction lies in what scholars call tacit knowledge, the understanding that exists only in human minds and hands, the expertise that cannot be written down because those who possess it often cannot articulate what they know. A master welder who produces perfect joints every time might not be able to explain exactly how they achieve such consistency. Their hands know things their words cannot express. They feel when the metal is responding correctly, hear when the equipment is operating at optimal conditions, sense when a setup looks right, even if every measured dimension falls within tolerance. When that master welder retires, their tacit knowledge vanishes with them. Written procedures capture explicit knowledge, the steps that can be documented and trained. They cannot capture the judgment, intuition, and accumulated experience that transform competent work into exceptional work. This is what happened to Apollo, but on a scale so vast it defies casual comprehension. Imagine having Mozart's complete musical scores, every note perfectly preserved, yet finding that nobody alive can play them as he intended. The sheet music exists, the instruments exist, but the interpretive knowledge, the understanding of phrasing and tempo, and emotional expression that brings those notes to life has disappeared entirely. This is our relationship with the Apollo program. We have the score, we lack the musicians. Can you believe that a civilization could forget how to do something it has already done? That seems impossible, doesn't it? Like forgetting how to ride a bicycle or swim. Surely such capabilities once mastered become permanent features of collective human knowledge. Surely they cannot simply evaporate. Yet they can, they do, and they have. Think of it this way. Your grandmother had a recipe for a soup so perfect that its taste has haunted you for decades. You watched her make it countless times. You even helped occasionally measuring ingredients, stirring the pot. She never wrote the recipe down because she never needed to. It existed in her memory, in her hands, in the automatic adjustments she made based on the weather, in the particular vegetables available that day, the condition of her stove. When she passed away, that recipe vanished. You can approximate it. You can get close. But you will never recreate it exactly because the knowledge that made it perfect existed only in her, and it left the world when she did. Now multiply that loss by billions of dollars. Add the complexity of sending humans through the most hostile environment imaginable. make the stakes not a disappointing soup, but the ability of our species to reach beyond our home planet. That is what we lost with Apollo. Except we did not lose it through death or accident. We threw it away, deliberately, to save money. This is the story of the greatest destruction of knowledge in human history, a vandalism so complete, so systematic, that 50 years later, we are still discovering what we can no longer do. And it begins in a factory the size of 40 football fields where miracles were manufactured and then abandoned to rust and silence. Picture a cathedral of industry. The Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1968. This structure covers 832 acres, an area so vast that standing at one end, you cannot see the other through the industrial haze. Inside this cavernous space, more than 10,000 people work with a precision and dedication that borders on religious devotion. These are not ordinary factory workers performing repetitive tasks. These are specialists, craftsmen, engineers, and technicians who have spent years developing skills that exist nowhere else on Earth. The equipment they operate was designed specifically for Apollo, built to specifications that no commercial application would ever justify. Specialized welding machines that cost more than houses join aluminum alloy panels thinner than credit cards, with such precision that the resulting structures can withstand forces that would crush a nuclear submarine like a tin can. The aluminum itself is exotic, formulated to exact specifications produced in small batches by suppliers who maintain dedicated production lines just for this program. The thickness of each panel is measured in thousandths of an inch. The welds must be perfect, because any flaw, no matter how microscopic, could cause catastrophic failure when the rocket experiences the violence of launch, when acoustic waves pound the structure with energy that makes your bones vibrate if you stand too close. Quality control inspectors examine every weld under magnification, rejecting components for imperfections invisible to the naked eye. The rejected parts are not merely flawed, they are dangerous. In the unforgiving environment of spaceflight, marginal components do not fail gracefully. They fail catastrophically, instantly, with consequences that end missions and lives. This factory produces exactly one product, the first stage of the Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that will carry human beings to the moon. Every component serves this singular purpose. Nothing is built for any other use. The entire industrial ecosystem exists in service of a goal so specific, so defined, that optimization becomes possible in ways that modern programs cannot replicate. Now advance 15 years. Walk through that same facility in 1983. The workers are gone. The specialized welding equipment has been sold for scrap metal or donated to museums where schoolchildren press their faces against glass to see relics of a vanished age. The custom tools that existed nowhere else on the planet have been melted down for their raw materials, their unique capabilities erased from existence as surely as if they had never been invented. The engineers who understood how everything fit together have retired to Florida, condominiums moved to aerospace companies, building commercial aircraft, or passed away with their knowledge unrecorded. Some tried to document what they knew. They wrote technical reports, created training manuals, recorded their insights in memos and presentations. But documentation captures only what can be articulated. The deeper knowledge, the intuitive understanding that develops through years of daily practice, resists capture in words and diagrams. The blueprints remain in filing cabinets and government archives. Thousands upon thousands of technical drawings document what was built, showing every dimension, every material specification, every assembly sequence. Yet these blueprints have become archaeological artifacts. They describe a civilization's capabilities without conveying the ability to replicate them. The institutional knowledge, the countless small decisions, the workarounds, the improvisations, and the tribal wisdom that made those blueprints actually function has evaporated like morning dew beneath a rising sun. This is not a hypothetical scenario constructed to make a dramatic point. This is precisely what happened. The story repeated itself with haunting similarity across every major component of the Apollo program. The command module factory in Downey, California fell silent. The lunar module plant in Bethpage, New York shifted to building other aircraft. The rocket engine test facilities in Hancock County, Mississippi stood dormant for years. The guidance computer laboratories at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory dispersed their teams to universities and private companies across the country. Think about this for a moment. Imagine discovering dinosaur DNA perfectly preserved in amber. You have the complete genetic code, every chromosome, every gene. But having the code does not mean you can create a living dinosaur. You need to understand developmental biology, cellular mechanics, and countless other factors that the DNA itself does not encode. The recipe exists, but the cooking knowledge has been lost. Is there anything more valuable than gold that we simply threw away like garbage? The answer is knowledge. Living, breathing, practical knowledge held in human minds and hands. And we discarded it to save the cost of maintaining empty buildings. But the real catastrophe lies deeper still in the heart of the machine that made everything possible. At the base of every Saturn V rocket sat 5 monsters, 5 F1 engines, each standing 19 feet tall, each measuring 12 feet across its bell-shaped nozzle. Together, these 5 engines produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust at sea level. To understand what this means, imagine the raw force required to lift a fully loaded aircraft carrier straight off the ocean's surface and accelerate it toward the sky. That is the power we are discussing. The F1 remains the most powerful single-chamber, liquid-fueled rocket engine ever successfully flown. Every space shuttle launch, every modern rocket uses engines with less raw power than these machines built in the 1960s. The turbopumps that fed propellant to the combustion chamber moved liquid oxygen and kerosene at rates exceeding 40,000 gallons per minute volumes, so vast they defy everyday intuition. These engines were manufactured by the Rocketdyne division of North American Aviation at their facility in Canoga Park, California. Production techniques existed only within that specific facility, developed through years of trial and error, as engineers solved problems that textbooks could not anticipate. The manufacturing process relied on craftsmen, particularly welders, whose skills reached levels that approached art. There is a legend among aerospace engineers about the old welders at Rocketdyne. These men, and they were mostly men of a certain generation, possessed what younger engineers called magic hands. They could produce welds of such perfection, such consistency, that the joints were often stronger than the base metal. They worked by feel and sound and visual cues so subtle that cameras could not capture them. When you asked them how they knew a weld was good, they would shrug and say something unhelpful like, "You just know." This was not mysticism, this was tacit knowledge in its purest form. When production ended in 1968, after building 65 flight-worthy engines, Rocketdyne retained the technical drawings and specifications. What they did not retain, what they could not retain, was the institutional knowledge embedded in the workers who actually built the engines. These workers understood thousands of small details that never appeared in any official documentation. They knew which welds required extra attention because the metal behaved unexpectedly at certain temperatures. They knew which dimensional tolerances could be pushed slightly without affecting performance, and which tolerances were absolutely critical. Fast forward to 2013, NASA's Exploration Technology Development Program conducted a detailed study attempting to build a simplified version of the F1 using advanced manufacturing techniques. The engineers had access to everything. Original blueprints, archived engines they could disassemble and measure, computer-aided design tools that would have seemed like sorcery to 1960s engineers, 3-dimensional printing capabilities that could create geometries impossible to machine, simulation software that could model fluid dynamics and combustion with precision that earlier generations could only dream about. They failed, not completely but substantially. They could build something that looked like an F1, but getting it to work reliably to match the performance and durability of the original, that proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The combustion chamber presented the most significant puzzle. Early F1 development had been plagued by combustion instability, violent pressure oscillations that could destroy an engine in milliseconds. Rocketdyne engineers solved this problem through extensive trial and error testing, modification after modification, until they found configurations that worked reliably. The solutions they developed were empirical rather than theoretical. They knew what worked, but not fully why it worked. The knowledge was embedded in the hardware geometry, rather than in equations that could be transferred to new designs. Modern engineers studying the F1 could see what the combustion chamber looked like. They could measure every dimension with precision far exceeding original manufacturing tolerances. What they could not determine was which dimensions were critical and which were incidental. The original engineers had tried many configurations before finding stable solutions. The final design incorporated features that prevented instability, but which specific features mattered most remained unclear. Some design elements might have been essential. Others might have been artifacts of the development process retained simply because no one had tested what would happen without them. This is the horrifying truth. We know what worked. We do not know why it worked. And without knowing why, we cannot reliably recreate it. It is like looking at the pyramids of Egypt. They stand there massive and undeniable. We can measure every stone map, every passage. But building another pyramid exactly like them, using only the tools and knowledge available to the ancient Egyptians, we would be helpless. Or think of it this way: you find the best bowl of pho you have ever tasted at a small restaurant. The flavors are perfect, the broth complex and balanced in ways you have never experienced before. You go back again and again. Then one day the restaurant is gone. No forwarding address, no recipe left behind. You spend years trying to recreate that broth. You get close sometimes, but never quite right. The knowledge of how to make it perfectly has vanished from the world, and no amount of chemical analysis or culinary expertise can bring it back. If we create something without truly understanding it, who is really in control, the machine or us? This question becomes disturbing when you realize we cannot answer it with confidence. And this is just one engine, one component of one stage of one rocket. The entire system, every piece of Apollo, has experienced similar knowledge loss. The ghost of what we once could do haunts us, visible but untouchable, a reminder that capability is more fragile than we imagined. The Apollo program at its peak employed approximately 400,000 people across more than 20,000 contractors and suppliers. This number represents something far more significant than mere headcount. This was a collective superintelligence, a distributed network of human expertise more powerful than any computer system that existed at the time or would exist for decades to come. These 400,000 individuals were not interchangeable workers performing routine tasks. Each person occupied a node in a vast knowledge network, holding specialized understanding that existed nowhere else. Engineers who could diagnose problems through intuition developed over thousands of hours of practice. Technicians who knew the peculiarities of specific equipment, the way you know the quirks of your own car. Inspectors who could spot defects that instruments could not measure. Managers who understood which formal procedures mattered critically and which could be safely adjusted when circumstances demanded flexibility. Among the most remarkable examples of this distributed expertise were the women who manufactured core rope memory for the Apollo guidance computer. These workers, chosen for their exceptional manual dexterity and extraordinary patience, physically wove copper wire through tiny magnetic cores to encode software instructions. Each memory module required weeks of meticulous labor threading, wire through arrays of ferrite rings, with precision measured in fractions of a millimeter. The process sounds almost medieval in its manual character. In an era racing toward automation, here were human hands performing tasks that seemed impossibly delicate, impossibly precise. Yet no machine could replicate what these women accomplished. The engineers at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, despite their advanced degrees and theoretical sophistication, depended utterly on manufacturing capabilities that could not be automated, that required human judgment operating at levels machines could not approach. This represents tacit knowledge in its purest, most undeniable form. You cannot write instructions that capture how to weave core rope memory successfully. You can describe the steps, certainly. You can show diagrams and photographs, but the actual skill, the ability to maintain proper tension to route wires through correct cores without error, to recognize when something looks wrong, despite every measurement indicating correctness, this develops only through practice. Under guidance from someone who already possesses the skill, the master craftsmen who built Apollo's hardware possessed similar expertise. They could feel when metal was responding correctly to heat treatment by touching it with bare hands, sensing temperature gradients that thermometers measured too slowly to capture. They could hear when machinery was operating optimally by listening to subtle changes in vibration frequency, detecting problems before instruments registered any anomaly. They knew which tolerances truly mattered and which were conservative margins that could be adjusted without compromising function. This knowledge existed in their nervous systems, in pattern recognition capabilities, developed through years of experience, in ways that resist translation into written procedures. When you asked these craftsmen how they knew something was right, they often could not articulate an answer. You just know they would say frustrating engineers who wanted to document everything, but this was not mysticism or stubborn secrecy. This was the honest acknowledgement that some knowledge cannot be spoken because it exists below the level of conscious awareness. In July of 1973, this 400,000-person superintelligence began to dissolve. Contracts ended, facilities closed, workers moved to other industries, to automotive plants, to electronics companies, to construction firms, anywhere their skills could find new employment. The concentrated expertise that had existed in integrated form, where every person's knowledge connected to every other person's knowledge through organizational pathways, diluted throughout the broader economy until it essentially vanished. The dilution metaphor is precise here. Imagine pouring a concentrated solution of some rare element into the ocean. The atoms do not cease to exist. They remain scattered across billions of cubic kilometers of seawater. But recovering them becomes effectively impossible. The concentration that made them useful has been destroyed beyond any practical hope of reconstitution. By 1985, just 12 years after Apollo's peak, finding someone who had actually worked on Saturn V production required archaeological effort. The institutional directories were obsolete. The professional networks had dissolved. The people had scattered to 1,000 different locations and 1,000 different careers. Their Apollo expertise had faded from active use into distant memory, like a language learned in childhood but not spoken for decades. Think about what this represents. 400,000 brain cells in a civilization's collective mind, all going dark simultaneously. The body survives, basic functions continue, but complex integrated capabilities that required coordination across multiple knowledge domains become impossible to execute. The knowledge has not been destroyed in some absolute sense. It exists somewhere in the dispersed population, but it cannot be reassembled, cannot be reintegrated into functional capability. When the masters leave, can mastery return? This is not a rhetorical question. It demands a genuine answer, and that answer is deeply uncomfortable. Mastery can return, yes, but only through the same painful process by which it was originally developed through years of practice, through mistakes and corrections, through accumulated experience that cannot be rushed, regardless of how much money you spend or how urgently you need results. This is the meta-knowledge problem. Modern engineers studying Apollo face a challenge more profound than simple ignorance. They must reconstruct not just technical facts, but the entire framework of understanding within which those facts made sense. They must rediscover which problems mattered, which solutions worked, which approaches failed, and why. The documentation tells them what was done. It does not explain the thought process behind decisions, the alternatives considered, and rejected the insights that emerged from failure. And this story, as painful as it sounds, becomes more agonizing still when you understand one crucial fact. This was not an accident. This was not an unfortunate consequence of unforeseen circumstances. This entire catastrophe was the result of deliberate decisions made by people who understood exactly what they were destroying. Because everything that happened next was not misfortune, it was policy. Throughout his tenure as NASA administrator, from 1961 to 1968, James Webb repeatedly stood before Congress and delivered warnings that proved prophetic in their accuracy and tragic in their reconcentration. Futility. He explained with clarity that terminating Apollo production capability would destroy industrial infrastructure that could never be rebuilt at comparable cost. He urged legislators to consider maintaining at least minimal production capability, even a single Saturn V every few years, to preserve options for future lunar missions. Congress listened politely, then they completely ignored him. Between 1972 and 1975, the entire industrial base that put human beings on the moon was systematically dismantled. This was not gradual decline. This was not passive neglect. This was active destruction executed contract by contract, facility by facility, with full knowledge of what was being lost. The dismantlement followed a precise pattern. First, production contracts were terminated, ending the flow of money that sustained workforce employment. Workers were laid off or transferred to other programs. Next, specialized equipment was declared surplus. Machinery that had cost millions to develop was sold for scrap value or donated to museums. Then facilities were repurposed or abandoned entirely. Buildings that had housed miracles of engineering became warehouses for mundane commercial products. Nothing was preserved for potential future use. Nothing was mothballed with careful attention to maintaining functionality. Everything was discarded immediately to eliminate ongoing maintenance costs. The accountants calculated savings with impressive precision. Every dollar not spent on maintaining idle facilities appeared as a line item showing fiscal responsibility, demonstrating prudent management of taxpayer resources. What these calculations could not capture, what spreadsheet logic cannot encompass, is the value of preserving capability for future needs that cannot be precisely predicted. How do you quantify in present dollars the option value of being able to return to the moon in 1990, or 2000, or 2020? How do you measure the cost of knowledge loss that will not become apparent for decades? You cannot. So the calculations proceeded as if these values were zero. Save money now. Worry about future capabilities when future needs become clear. This seemed rational, given contemporary assumptions about how space exploration would evolve. Apollo was never designed to create sustainable capability. It was designed to win a race. President Kennedy's commitment in May of 1961 specified landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade ended. Notice the precision of this language. Before the decade ended, not an established permanent presence, not and maintain the capability to return, just reach the finish line before the clock runs out. This goal-oriented framing shaped every aspect of program design. Contractors were hired to accomplish specific missions within a specific time frame. Facilities were built to support a defined production run. Nothing anticipated continuation beyond initial objectives. Everyone understood from the beginning that Apollo was a sprint, not a marathon, a temporary mobilization, not a permanent establishment. Most space planners in 1972 believed the space shuttle would revolutionize access to orbit, making expendable rockets like Saturn V obsolete. The shuttle was supposed to fly frequently, cheaply, reliably, opening space to routine operations the way commercial aviation had opened the skies. If this vision materialized, Saturn V would become a museum piece, its production methods relegated to historical curiosity. So preserving Saturn V production capability seemed unnecessary. Why maintain expensive infrastructure for a system that was about to be superseded by superior technology? Better to invest resources in the future than in preserving the past. Think about the absurdity here. It is like climbing Mount Everest after years of preparation and enormous expense, then immediately destroying all the ropes, ladders, and equipment used in the ascent to save storage costs. Future climbers wanting to reach the summit would start from nothing, reinventing techniques that had already proven successful. Or imagine this: you win the Nobel Prize for groundbreaking research. Then you burn your dissertation, destroy all your notes, and discard all your experimental equipment because storing them costs money for archive fees and warehouse space. The achievement remains in record books, but the knowledge of how it was accomplished vanishes, making it nearly impossible for anyone to build upon your work. Why would any civilization destroy its own greatest achievement? The answer reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how human institutions actually operate. Political systems function on timescales measured in years. Elections happen every 2 or 4 years. Administrations change. Priorities shift. Budget pressures demand immediate savings that can be reported in the next fiscal quarter. Space exploration requires timescales measured in decades. Developing new capabilities takes 10 or 15 years minimum. Maintaining industrial infrastructure demands sustained investment across multiple political cycles. These timescales are fundamentally incompatible in ways that create systematic bias towards short-term savings over long-term capability preservation. The accountants who calculated savings from shutting down Apollo facilities were not wrong in their arithmetic. The money saved was real, substantial, and immediately visible in budget documents. What could not appear in those documents was the future cost of lost capability, the price that would be paid decades later when the nation wanted to return to the moon and discovered it no longer knew how. So the decision was made: save money now, accept constraints later. Apollo's production capability was destroyed deliberately, methodically, completely. And 50 years later, the consequences of that decision still haunt every attempt to return to the lunar surface that lies just 239,000 miles away, unchanged since the last astronaut departed in December of 1972. The Apollo command module contained approximately 2 million individual parts. This number sounds staggering until you understand what it represents. Not versatility, not flexibility, not adaptation to multiple purposes. Those 2 million parts existed to accomplish exactly one mission profile, carrying 3 astronauts to lunar orbit, supporting them during their journey, and returning them safely through Earth's atmosphere. Nothing in the command module was designed for reuse. Nothing anticipated upgrade. Nothing was built with expansion in mind. Every single component served this singular purpose with the focused intensity of a samurai sword forged for one type of cut, perfected through elimination of everything extraneous. This radical simplicity represented Apollo's greatest engineering triumph and explains precisely why its approach cannot be repeated in the modern era. When engineers at North American Aviation received the contract to design and build the Apollo command module in 1961, they faced constraints that contemporary spacecraft designers would find almost liberating in their clarity. The mission parameters were fixed, the crew size was determined, the flight duration was bounded within narrow limits, the destinations were specified. Under these crystalline constraints, optimization became possible in ways that modern programs cannot replicate regardless of budget or talent. Every gram of the command module served a specific documented purpose that engineers could trace directly to mission requirements. Every electrical connection interfaced with other systems through carefully defined pathways that would never need modification. Every structural element was sized for loads that could be precisely calculated because the flight profile was completely known. Engineers could make design decisions that sacrificed future flexibility for present performance, because there was no future to consider beyond the defined mission set. The spacecraft needed to work perfectly for a specific sequence of events. Absolutely nothing else mattered. This is the samurai philosophy applied to aerospace engineering. One blade, one purpose. Absolute perfection within that narrow domain. The hatch design illustrates this philosophy with painful clarity. After the Apollo 1 fire that claimed 3 astronauts in January of 1967, investigators discovered that the inward opening hatch could not be opened against internal pressure created by the fire. The redesigned hatch opened outward and could be operated in seconds. But this redesign addressed only the specific failure mode that had caused the tragedy. Engineers did not add redundant hatches. They did not create emergency escape systems for scenarios beyond the defined mission profile. They did not build in flexibility for future mission types that might require different egress options. They solved the immediate problem with the minimum necessary change because the program could not afford delays for comprehensive redesign, and comprehensive redesign was not needed for the missions they would actually fly. Now consider the Artemis program's Orion capsule. This spacecraft must serve mission types that span an enormous spectrum of durations, destinations, and objectives. The same basic vehicle that carries astronauts to lunar orbit must be capable of supporting missions to the planned Gateway Station in lunar orbit. It must accommodate potential future missions to Mars or its moons. It must dock with vehicles that have not yet been designed using interfaces that must be standardized before those vehicles exist. It must be manufactured using processes sustainable across decades of production, rather than the few years of Apollo's industrial sprint. Each of these requirements adds complexity that ripples through every aspect of spacecraft design. The life support system provides a representative example. Apollo's environmental control was engineered to keep 3 astronauts alive and functional for approximately 14 days, the maximum duration of a lunar landing mission, including transit time in both directions, plus surface operations. The system was simple by necessity, robust through conservative design margins, and completely disposable. Orion's environmental control and life support system must support missions of varying duration, with crews of varying size. The baseline system supports 4 astronauts for 21 days, but this baseline represents only one point in an operational envelope that must expand substantially for future missions. The same fundamental architecture must scale across this enormous range without complete redesign for each new mission type. This is the brutal law that governs all engineering. Simplicity equals strength. Versatility equals weakness. A Japanese katana forged for centuries using techniques perfected through elimination of everything unnecessary will outlast a Swiss Army knife with its dozen folding tools, each adequate but none exceptional. Does flexibility always mean fragility? The question demands honest examination because the answer shapes everything that follows. Then the nightmare of software emerged. The Apollo guidance computer executed software comprising approximately 145,000 lines of assembly code. This represents less code than runs a modern dishwasher with digital controls. The software was written by a small, tightly integrated team at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, who understood every instruction intimately, who could trace execution paths through the entire program, who grasped the complete system within their collective cognitive capacity. When anomalies occurred during missions, flight controllers in Houston could predict precisely how the software would respond because the entire codebase remained within human mental grasp. Programmers had written every line. They knew what each instruction did, how different modules interacted, what would happen under various combinations of inputs and conditions. The software was comprehensible in the most literal sense. It could be comprehended by human minds working together. The flight software for Orion contains millions of lines of code distributed across multiple processors, executing dozens of distinct applications. No single engineer understands the complete system. No individual human mind can hold the full complexity of software interactions that govern spacecraft behavior. This is not a criticism of modern programmers. It is recognition of fundamental limits on human cognitive capacity. Development required hundreds of programmers organized into teams that worked on different subsystems, coordinating through interface control documents and integration testing, rather than shared comprehensive understanding. The weather display module talks to the navigation system through carefully defined interfaces. The power management software coordinates with the communication system through standardized protocols. Each team understands their own domain deeply. No one understands everything. This distributed development model becomes necessary beyond certain complexity thresholds. No alternative exists for software systems of modern scale, but distribution introduces failure modes that small integrated teams never confronted. Different teams working from different assumptions can create components that function perfectly in isolation, but fail catastrophically when integrated. Boeing's Starliner capsule experienced this exact problem during its first uncrewed orbital flight test in December of 2019. The spacecraft's mission elapsed timer, a fundamental clock that synchronized operations throughout the vehicle, had been initialized using a value from the Atlas V launch vehicle's computer, rather than an independent Starliner. Time reference. This seemingly minor discrepancy caused the spacecraft to believe it was at a different point in its mission timeline than reality indicated. The vehicle consumed excessive propellant, attempting to execute maneuvers appropriate for a mission phase it had not actually reached. The error cascaded through multiple systems as software modules made decisions based on incorrect timing information. Only intervention by ground controllers prevented complete mission failure and possible loss of the spacecraft. Boeing's programmers were not incompetent. They were wrestling with a challenge that grows inherently more difficult as software systems expand. The number of potential interactions between software components increases exponentially with the number of components. Testing every possible combination of states, inputs, timing, relationships, and failure modes becomes mathematically impossible beyond a certain complexity threshold. Think about what this means. With 1,000 strands of wire, cutting any single strand might cause catastrophic failure, but you cannot test every individual wire under every possible condition because the test matrix explodes beyond any practical capability to execute. Engineers must make informed assumptions about which scenarios are probable enough to warrant testing, hoping desperately that improbable scenarios never materialize during actual missions. Apollo's programmers could exhaustively test their software because the total state space was small enough to enumerate and explore. The guidance computer had limited memory, limited processing capability, limited interface complexity. These limitations, so constraining at the time, actually made comprehensive verification achievable. Engineers could trace every path through the code, identify every possible outcome, validate that the system would behave correctly under every conceivable circumstance. Modern software complexity has pushed programs irretrievably beyond this threshold. Comprehensive testing no longer exists as a meaningful concept. Instead, engineers rely on statistical sampling, formal verification methods, simulation, and accumulated operational experience to build confidence that software will perform correctly. These approaches provide reasonable assurance, but cannot eliminate uncertainty. It is like having 100 chefs each, brilliant in their specialty, all trying to cook one bowl of soup together. Every chef knows their craft perfectly. But does anyone understand how all the ingredients combine? Does anyone control the final flavor? When systems become more complex than human capacity to understand them, who actually controls what happens? This is not a theoretical question. This is the daily reality confronting engineers who build modern spacecraft. And if you think this software nightmare sounds terrible, wait until you see what happens with legacy hardware. The RS-25 engine represents arguably the most thoroughly proven large rocket engine in history. 3,000 successful test firings, 135 flights on the space shuttle across 3 decades of operations, a performance record that any new engine would require decades to match. 0 in-flight failures of the engine itself. This is the golden standard of rocket propulsion, refined through years of operational experience into a system that works with extraordinary reliability. So when NASA began developing the Space Launch System rocket for the Artemis program, the logical assumption suggested that reusing such mature, proven hardware would simplify development dramatically. The engines were well understood, their manufacturing processes were documented. Their operational characteristics had been validated through millions of seconds of accumulated runtime. Adapting them for a new launch vehicle should have been straightforward engineering rather than research and development. The reality proved insane in its difficulty. Reusing proven hardware turned out to be harder, more expensive, and more time-consuming than developing new engines from scratch would have been. The fundamental problem lies in context dependency. The RS-25 engines were designed to operate in a specific configuration. They mounted on the aft end of the Space Shuttle orbiter. They were fed propellant from the external tank through specific plumbing runs with specific pressure profiles. They were controlled by the orbiter's flight computers using particular command protocols. They experienced particular acoustic and vibration environments during launch and ascent. The Space Launch System core stage presents a different configuration in almost every respect. The engines mount directly on the rocket's tankage rather than on a separate vehicle. Propellant feed systems follow different paths with different pressure characteristics. Flight computers use different architectures, sending commands through different interfaces. The acoustic and vibration environment during launch differs significantly from shuttle's characteristics. Each of these differences required engineering analysis. Many required hardware modifications. Some necessitated changes to engine control algorithms. All demanded verification through testing because assumptions based on shuttle experience could not be automatically transferred to SLS operations. The engines needed to prove themselves in their new context. More fundamentally, the engines required requalification. An engine qualified for shuttle operations was not automatically qualified for SLS operations, even if the engine itself remained physically identical. Qualification demonstrates that hardware will perform correctly under specific conditions. Change those conditions and the qualification no longer applies. New qualification must be earned through testing that demonstrates adequate performance in the new environment. This requalification campaign consumed more than 10 years and billions of dollars resources that would not have been required for a purpose-built engine designed specifically for the SLS application from the beginning. The anticipated savings from reusing heritage hardware proved largely illusory. The effort required to adapt, modify, test, and qualify existing engines approached the effort that would have been required to develop new engines tailored precisely to program requirements. Think about the painful truth here. Legacy becomes a burden when context changes. It is like transplanting a Ferrari engine into a freight truck. The engine is magnificent, absolutely perfect for what it was designed to do, but everything around it is wrong. The transmission does not match. The cooling system operates differently. The fuel delivery works on different principles. The vehicle weight and aerodynamics create loads the engine never experienced in its original application. you can make it work. But making it work requires so much adaptation, so much modification, so much testing to verify that the adaptations function correctly, that starting fresh might have been easier. Or imagine this scenario. You are a medieval knight wearing armor perfected through centuries of battlefield experience. That armor is absolutely ideal for sword combat on horseback. Now transport yourself to a modern battlefield with automatic weapons and artillery. Your armor becomes a burden. It is heavy, restricting your movement. It offers no protection against modern threats. It was perfect for its original context and completely unsuited for the new one. Why does perfection in the past become useless for the future? Because perfection is always perfection for something specific, under particular conditions, in a defined context. Change the context sufficiently, and perfection becomes obsolescence. But the true chaos does not come from hardware or software alone. It comes from coordination. The Artemis program involves NASA, the European Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, commercial providers like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and numerous other international partners contributing various components and capabilities. This multinational public-private partnership brings resources that NASA could not afford independently, while distributing costs across multiple budgets and creating political support in multiple countries. It also creates coordination complexity that Apollo never confronted. Each additional partner adds interfaces. Each interface must be carefully designed to accommodate all possible combinations of connected elements. And complexity does not increase linearly with partners. It increases exponentially following mathematical relationships that quickly overwhelm human capacity to manage. The brutal mathematics works like this. 2 components require 1 interface between them. 3 components require 3 interfaces. 4 components need 6 interfaces. 10 components demand 45 interfaces. Each interface represents engineering, effort, documentation, testing, and ongoing maintenance. Double the number of components, and you quadruple the integration work. Triple the components and testing effort increases by a factor of 9. Apollo contained perhaps a few hundred critical interfaces between major systems connections that required careful specification and verification. Artemis encompasses thousands of such interfaces, each demanding its own design effort, testing protocol, and documentation package. The total engineering labor required to validate a modular multinational design vastly exceeds the effort needed for a purpose-built system like Apollo. The International Space Station demonstrates both the benefits and costs of multilateral space cooperation with painful clarity. The station could not have been constructed without contributions from Russia, Europe, Japan, Canada, and other partners. International participation distributed costs while providing capabilities that no single nation could have afforded independently. But the partnership also introduced delays that would not have affected a unilateral program. Russian modules arrived years behind schedule due to that nation's economic difficulties following the Soviet collapse. Everything waited. When Russian components finally launched, they sometimes did not fit properly with American systems despite years of interface coordination. Engineering workarounds consumed time and money resolving problems that careful planning had supposedly prevented. Most frustratingly, technical decisions sometimes yielded to political considerations. The station had to use Russian docking standards for certain connections because political agreements demanded it, even though American engineers preferred different approaches. Technical optimization became secondary to maintaining partnership harmony. Each partner nation operates under its own political cycle, its own budget process, its own procurement regulations, its own engineering standards. Components that one partner commits to providing may be delayed when domestic politics redirect resources. Schedule coordination requires aligning activities across time zones, languages, and organizational cultures that approach problems with fundamentally different assumptions. Imagine an orchestra with 100 musicians each, playing from a different score, each following a different conductor, each convinced their interpretation is correct. How do you create harmony? Who actually leads? What happens when sections disagree about tempo, or when instruments arrive late for rehearsal? Or think of it this way: 10 people trying to drive one car. Everyone wants to hold the steering wheel. Everyone has opinions about the route. Everyone insists their driving style is safest. The car has enormous potential power from all this human energy. But can it move forward, or does it tear itself apart from internal contradictions? When does cooperation become obstruction? This question has no comfortable answer because both outcomes coexist simultaneously. The cooperation enables capabilities that would otherwise be impossible. The coordination overhead delays everything, increases costs, and introduces failure modes that purely national programs never confronted. Apollo's simplicity avoided this trap entirely by rejecting cooperation. The United States built everything, controlled everything, decided everything without consultation or compromise. This unilateral approach enabled rapid decision-making, but required resources that no modern program can access. Yet, even all of this, the software complexity, the heritage hardware burdens the international coordination challenges. Even all of this complexity still does not represent the worst obstacle confronting modern lunar programs. On the morning of January 28, 1986, ice coated the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. Temperatures had plunged overnight to -2 degrees Celsius, far below the design limits for critical components of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had spent the previous evening in urgent teleconferences, with NASA management pleading desperately that the rubber O-ring seals between booster segments could not be trusted to function properly in such extreme cold. The seals had never been tested at temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Launch morning temperatures hovered around 36 degrees. The engineers recommended delaying the mission until warmer weather arrived. Their voices carried the weight of technical expertise and genuine fear. They knew what could happen. They begged management to listen. NASA management pushed back hard. The agency faced schedule pressure from multiple directions. President Reagan planned to mention the mission in his State of the Union address that evening. The Teacher in Space program had generated enormous public interest with schoolchildren across America, preparing to watch Krista McAuliffe conduct lessons from orbit. Previous launch delays had already attracted criticism. Another postponement would be embarrassing, would undermine confidence, would suggest operational problems. Under this relentless pressure, Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and recommended proceeding with launch. 73 seconds after liftoff, hot combustion gases burned through an O-ring seal that cold temperatures had rendered brittle and unresponsive. The resulting flame impinged on the external fuel tank, triggering structural failure. Challenger broke apart at an altitude of 48,000 feet. All 7 crew members perished. 17 years later, on February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during atmospheric re-entry. The cause traced to damage sustained during launch when a piece of foam insulation broke free from the external tank and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing. This debris strike was observed on launch footage and analysed by a team of engineers who grew increasingly concerned about potential damage to the thermal protection system. These engineers requested that NASA obtain satellite imagery or ground-based telescope observations of Columbia's wing while the shuttle remained in orbit. Such imagery might reveal the extent of damage and inform decisions about whether the crew faced danger during re-entry. Management denied the request, judging that the imagery would not change any decisions and was therefore unnecessary, not worth the effort to coordinate. The vehicle attempted re-entry with a compromised heat shield. Superheated plasma entered the wing structure through the damaged area, progressively destroying the vehicle from within. Columbia broke apart over Texas, at an altitude exceeding 200,000 feet, while traveling at 18 times the speed of sound. All 7 astronauts perished. 14 people across 2 disasters, separated by nearly 2 decades, but connected by common institutional failures. Engineers raised safety concerns. Management dismissed those concerns based on schedule pressure and institutional assumptions about acceptable risk. These losses transformed NASA, permanently changing the organization's DNA in ways that can never be reversed. During Apollo, NASA's internal probabilistic risk assessments estimated that each mission carried approximately a 96% chance of returning its crew safely to Earth. This implied roughly a 4% probability of catastrophic failure, approximately 1 chance in 25 that any given mission would end in tragedy. The astronauts understood these odds. They accepted them, They flew anyway because the goal mattered enough to justify the danger. Modern safety culture renders such risk acceptance institutionally impossible. The accumulated trauma of Challenger and Columbia creates expectations that approach zero tolerance for crew loss. From brave warriors willing to face mortality for exploration, we have become an organization terrified of every risk, paralyzed by the memory of past failures. When does safety become chains that prevent movement? When does protection transform into imprisonment? The answer lies in understanding what happened next, in seeing how the mechanisms designed to prevent disaster also prevent achievement. Absolute safety means never leaving bed. But exploration by definition means venturing where safety cannot be guaranteed. This is why Apollo cannot be repeated under modern constraints. The mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophic failures simultaneously prevent the bold decisions that enable ambitious exploration. Independent safety organizations were established after Challenger with formal authority to halt programs that fail to meet defined standards. These organizations report outside normal program management chains, making them resistant to schedule pressure, but also removing incentives to balance safety against other program objectives. The psychology of modern officials creates an asymmetry that inexorably drives decisions toward caution. Approving a launch that results in crew loss means the end of your career public humiliation, possible criminal investigation, and permanent association with tragedy. Your name becomes linked forever with failure. But delaying a launch to conduct additional testing carries essentially no professional consequences. No NASA manager has ever been fired for being too careful. Many have seen their careers destroyed for being insufficiently cautious in retrospect. This asymmetry shapes every decision. When engineers raise concerns, managers respond by requiring additional testing. When testing reveals anomalies, executives demand independent reviews. When reviews identify uncertainties, oversight boards mandate more analysis. The cycle repeats endlessly, driven by individual career preservation rather than program optimization. The Space Launch System core stage consumed more than 10 years of development, despite using engines that had already accumulated thousands of hours of successful operation on the space shuttle. The Orion crew capsule similarly required more than a decade before carrying astronauts benefiting from lessons learned across the entire history of American human spaceflight, yet still demanding exhaustive verification before flight. Compare this to Saturn V, which flew its first crewed mission on only its third launch overall. The previous two flights had carried no crew and served primarily to verify that the vehicle would not explode catastrophically during ascent. By modern standards, this minimal demonstration, before trusting human lives to the vehicle, appears almost reckless. The complete launch system had been tested only twice before astronauts climbed aboard and rode it toward the moon. Modern safety culture makes such minimal testing institutionally impossible. Every decision must be defensible in potential future investigations. Documentation must demonstrate that all reasonable precautions were taken, that all concerns were addressed, that no warning was ignored. The safest testimony after a disaster is always that additional analysis was requested, additional testing was conducted, additional reviews were performed. It is like owning a Ferrari, but never driving it because you fear scratches and dents. The car sits in the garage perfect and pristine and utterly useless. The potential remains unrealized because risk avoidance has become the primary objective, overwhelming the original purpose of having the vehicle. If you cannot accept risk, can you still call what you do exploration? Or has it become something else, entirely, something safer, but also something less, a performance of caution rather than a genuine venture into the unknown? This is the most painful part of the story, understanding that the same impulses that protect also constrain, that safety and achievement exist in tension that cannot be fully resolved. But even this crushing weight of safety requirements does not represent the greatest obstacle confronting modern lunar programs. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the decade ended. This speech is remembered as visionary leadership, an inspiring call to national greatness. What these commemorations typically omit is the political context that made Kennedy's words viable, a context so specific to its historical moment that it can never be recreated. Kennedy's announcement came exactly 43 days after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth. The American response had been Alan Shepard's 15-minute suborbital hop that barely scraped the edge of space. The contrast was humiliating. Soviet rockets were demonstrably more powerful, Soviet space capabilities were visibly more advanced, and Soviet propaganda was exploiting this superiority to argue that communist systems produced better results than capitalist democracies. The space race was never primarily about space. It was about proving which system of government could better harness human potential. Under these circumstances, Kennedy's moon commitment represented a calculated strategic gamble rather than scientific curiosity. The Cold War created political will that translated into 4.4% of the entire federal budget, flowing to NASA at Apollo's peak. The shocking truth is this: Apollo happened not because of love for science, but because of fear of the Soviet Union. Gagarin's orbit represented a humiliation that American pride could not tolerate, generating massive political momentum that swept aside normal budget constraints. Without that fear, without that competition, without that existential threat to American prestige, there would have been no Apollo. Political consensus supporting Apollo proved remarkably durable across changes in administration. Kennedy's vision survived his passing. Johnson embraced it with even greater commitment. Nixon continued it despite budget pressures. This continuity was rare in history, sustained only by the shared perception that losing the space race would represent geopolitical catastrophe. Today, no Soviet Union exists. No comparable adversary generates equivalent competitive pressure. China's space program advances steadily, but does not threaten American security in ways that motivate emergency mobilization. The strategic imperative has vanished, along with the Soviet state that created it. The brutal history of post-Apollo lunar ambitions reveals the consequences. President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative in 1989, calling for return to the Moon and eventual Mars missions. Congress refused to fund it. President George W. Bush announced the Constellation program in 2004, directing NASA to develop systems for lunar return. President Obama cancelled Constellation in 2010, wasting $9 billion. President Trump announced Artemis with a deadline of 2024. The deadline has slipped to 2027 or 2030, or perhaps later still. Every 4 to 8 years, each new president cancels the previous plan and initiates something new. Lunar programs require 20 to 30 years of sustained investment to achieve results. Democratic political cycles operate on 4-year intervals. These timescales are fundamentally incompatible. Politics fragments across 1,000 competing priorities. Healthcare spending exceeds NASA's budget by 30 to 1. Defense spending surpasses NASA by similar multiples. Infrastructure, education, social services, debt interest all demand resources that might otherwise support space exploration. Without Cold War urgency, lunar programs must compete for funding against every other claim on federal resources, running a marathon but changing runners every 5 kilometers. Who reaches the finish line? Building a house over 10 years but replacing the architect annually? What structure emerges? The metaphors capture the absurdity but cannot convey the frustration of programs that repeatedly approach success only to be cancelled by political transitions. Does modern democracy still possess sufficient patience for greatness? Or have our institutions become structurally incapable of sustaining the long-term commitments that ambitious exploration demands? The Moon remains exactly where Apollo left it 384,400 kilometers away, unchanged. The American flags have bleached white under 50 years of unfiltered ultraviolet radiation. The bootprints remain perfectly preserved in airless silence, waiting. The problem is not distance. The problem is that we have changed. 3 demons haunt us now: knowledge evaporated into the past, complexity beyond human comprehension, safety requirements that paralyze action. We are not less capable than our grandparents in terms of technology. We are imprisoned by constraints they never faced. Apollo possessed something we have lost, something more precious than any technical capability. The willingness to be crazy enough to dream impossible dreams and brave enough to accept terrible risks in pursuing them. This is not about rockets. This is about our souls, about whether human civilization retains the capacity for genuine daring. Apollo did not fail because we lack technology. It ended because we stopped accepting the risks that greatness demands. The question that defines our future is whether we can ever find that courage again.